Hi everyone, in this video we'll be looking into the origins of cells and life. Now, prior to doing that, we need to answer a couple of questions. What is the smallest unit of life, and how do we define something as living or non-living? Now, you can answer these last two questions later on in your free time, but we need to answer this first question together, and the answer to this question is cells. Now, cells are essentially complex structures that can only form from the division of pre-existing cells, i.e., it would require the existence of parent cells in order to give rise to daughter cells via the process of division. Now, given the sort of contingent relationship between daughter cells and parent cells, wherein daughter cells can only arise from the existence of a previous generation of parent cells that have undergone division, how did the first cells, the first generation of parent cells, ever come into existence? Now, that is our key question for this topic. Now, when trying to answer this question, we need to work around the idea that cells have certain properties, and these properties are that cells are essentially surrounded by a partially permeable membrane, and that they also contain a genetic material that can be passed on to new cells. And at the same time, they're also capable of certain metabolic processes that ultimately release energy for the purpose of tissue repair, replacement, or growth. Now, based on the idea that cells possess all of these different properties, we can kind of assume that the inception of cells, or the process of creating the first cells, would have looked a little like this. We would have had, following the theory of abiogenesis, which is essentially referring to a theory where non-living organisms or non-living substances would have given rise to living organisms. We would kind of assume the formation inception story of cells to look like this, where we have inorganic molecules or non-living things, and then they kind of congregate or combine together in order to form simple organic molecules, and then these simple organic molecules, also known as monomers, would have undergone polymerization in order to form polymers, and these polymers would have had the need to self-replicate, and they would have membranes around those polymers. So we can identify a couple of key components here. Now, following this sort of simple diagram, or the simple approach in order to how cells would have essentially formed at the start, we can kind of narrow everything down into three theories that may explain the origins of cells, and those are the protocell first theory, the gene first theory, and metabolism first theory. And in this video, we'll be mainly focusing on the protocell first theory. Now, if we look at the word protocell, we can clearly see that it's divided into two parts, proto and cell. Now, the prefix proto comes from the Greek word proto, and it essentially means first or the earliest. So combined together with the word cell, protocell would essentially refer to the first cell. Now, one thing that we really need to know about the protocell is that the protocell is a very simple cell-like structure that's formed from lipids or fatty acid membranes, and only when it comes in contact with water is it going to assemble in a vesicle-like structure. And these lipid-based vesicles, which are protocells, essentially would have acted as primitive enclosures, and they would have provided the necessary environment to concentrate certain reactants and at the same time facilitate chemical reactions and protect the earliest genetic molecules, which we speculate to be RNA, and that we will discuss right on. It is assumed that the protocell at the start of its inception would have not contained any genetic materials, but still it would have been capable of basic metabolic reactions and functions, and it would have also grown and divided into multiple daughter cells. It is assumed that after it gained all of these processes and gained all of these abilities, would they have been able to acquire genetic material, which is likely assumed to be RNA. Now, it's assumed that RNA instead of DNA would have been the first genetic material to have appeared in cells, and that is because RNA is much more simpler, and it can also act as a genetic material and at the same time and as enzymes, which would be able to catalyze its own replication as well as other reactions. And also not to mention that RNA monomers would have formed the building blocks of DNA as well. Alright, that is pretty much it for the protocell theory. We will be looking into the gene first theory next time, also known as RNA world.